So, having set that scene, Carol, do you want to field questions or do you want me to do it?
No, you do it.
Okay, the floor is open to questions. And please don't pick on me. We have 4 other very knowledgeable and able panel members here. And I'll actually divert some of the questions to them if it seems appropriate. Who'd like to start off? You didn't say anything that got anybody cranked up? Oh, okay, over there.
You drew a line around the Caribou points there in the Little Smoky and talked about that potentially being a good area within which to manage for the 65% habitat. We also heard this morning that that'll be done at a range level, so obviously we'll be delineating range boundaries. We also know that predator prey systems operate potentially on much bigger scales. And we heard this morning as well that habitat that has increased predation, which could come from very big scales, may also, critical habitat with increased predation from those scales may be ineffective. How are we going to deal with those two things? We've got a habitat management, which industry can contribute to, plus we need to deal with the predator prey stuff. Are you suggesting just that that's government's issue?
Well, I'll get perhaps Steve to tackle the envelope question.
The envelope.
Yeah, so he's talking about the, the range of a wolf territory might overlap core caribou area, but if you've got a moose factory all around it, then you've got an issue.
Yeah, that keeps me awake at night, honestly. I'm haunted by the large protected areas that we have. This isn't a boreal caribou issue, but it's certainly a mountain caribou issue where we have caribou going extinct in Banff, and we have them crashing in Jasper. And it's not as if we're creating a whole bunch of new linear disturbance in there. So we've got changes in the system that are happening at very large scales that we're limited in what we can do on a very local scale. So I don't think anybody thinks that restoring linear features in Jasper is going to save caribou. And I think that that's one of the issues that we're going to have to tackle as jurisdictions as we start to develop these range plans and action plans, that we're going to have to take a much broader perspective than managing to this kind of, this 65% threshold. Because first of all, it's not a threshold. There's nothing that suggests it is a threshold. It's a number that we've been asked to manage to. But I think if we put all our eggs in that basket, we could be creating little Jasper National Parks where we continue to have caribou declines despite despite making significant investments in things that may not have a lot of benefit. And I don't know if there's any biologists, any caribou biologists in the room who think that if we actually start rolling back the habitat to this magical 65%, that the white-tailed deer will go away, that suddenly things will go back the way they were, and that we'll all be okay. I think that's naive, and that we're going to have to be much more sophisticated in our development of action plans to address the problem.
Would anybody else like to chip in on that?
Can I?
Certainly.
Okay, that discussion came up quite a bit back in the early Little Smoky days. Sort of the best example is Layla Neufield's work. So if you had your figure of the Little Smoky, she had wolves collared in 5 packs, all of whom shared the Little Smoky, and none of whom you would argue that even nearly half their range was in the Little Smoky. And so the question became, what's the scale that you might consider the immediate effects of wolves? And I seem to recall in conversation with Stan and company in the past, something around 15 or 20 kilometers would be kind of like the radius of a wolf pack distribution. So, and I think we just had a discussion with the Boreal Forest Initiative people, and they've chosen, I think, a 20-kilometer around the range.
Yeah, what you're referring to there, Rob, is the Caribou methodological framework that's recently been released by the Canadian Board of Forest Agreement.
Right.
And it talks about an area outside the range that may have to be managed for primary prey and predators, because the predators might, as you say, incur into the core where the caribou are and are being supported by high levels of primary prey outside the
Right.
actual area that the caribou.
Which is, I think, the point of the question.
Yeah, and the other angle to the question was, how do you get something that's like that has to be managed by governments into what industry can do? And I think this is why it's so critical in my mind that industry and government sit down and work together on this, because my sense is that we often focus on our own little knitting and we miss the opportunity to work together for the greater good. And so it's so critical that if we say, okay, we're going to look after that 65% and the rest of the caribou range over time, that we don't get hooped by what's going on outside, and that government is managing outside there so that what we do inside there works. I think it's really important that that gets done.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, I don't know who, maybe I'll just, whoever wants to be on the spot, but this notion of having one of the ranges, and maybe it's a little smoky, as a test site for management actions, seismic line revegetation or restoration one, wolf reduction has happened there. I mean, there's broad scale, other factors of the landscape, maybe, a study on deer in that area. I just like some of the panel's thoughts on, should that be an approach, just to pick one or two herds and just really focus on doing management actions there to see how it goes.
Yeah.
Well, I'll speak again. I think that before we embark on something like that, and before we get to the point where we say, let's start investing in a large-scale program to restore linear features in Little Smoky, for instance, we should have some sort of estimate of exactly how many we think we have to restore to get the system back to where we want it to be. And we have to go through that step and then decide whether or not that is either feasible, both from an economic standpoint and from the standpoint of just a technical feasibility of doing it. Those are the kinds of analyses that I think we have to do before embarking on some of these projects. And we're at the stage of trying all these little pilots and saying, well, we're gonna mound some stuff here and we're gonna do some plantings over there and we'll see if it's gonna take. But the question really is, at what scale do you have to do those to get to meet the objectives that you want, and is that actually feasible? And to do those trade-offs before making some of those decisions.
I think from a research perspective, it's very nice to take a herd and say, okay, what can we learn from this? We'll do everything, we'll do all these studies. But the reality is that, you hear this, the time for action is now, and something has to be happening, I think, across all of the herds, and I think that's one thing that certainly came out of the recovery strategy. It's not, we need to learn how to do this. We know the footprint has some impacts. We know predators are an issue. We know prey is related to that. So we know a lot of these things already, but we don't know how to undo it. And there are a lot of initiatives going on, and I think bringing those together so that becomes our learning ground. Putting all of the Osley groups and the other groups and the Little Smoky crew, and putting these people at the same table, since everybody's working for the same end point, so that we learn from what we're already doing and start implementing it on the ground as we go. I think that's where we really need to be focusing our energy. There's lag times. I mean, it's 30 to 50 years lag times for this reclamation to happen, and so the predator and prey control, which is mentioned, and it's not an industry thing. It's something that has to be done by the province. That's an immediate action. The reclamation we still need to learn from. Those are long term, but something has to be happening in most of the herds now on a action-based plan.
However,
I was just going to sort of echo the same perspective. I think something has to be done in every range. I don't think we can wait to try something in one range and try and extrapolate that to the other ranges. It's too bad the GOA guys aren't here to give their perspective on that. But I think we've all heard, certainly from CAP's end, that GOA has a pretty aggressive mandate to do the range plans in every range, and the time for action is now, as Kim said. So I think we have to look forward to trying doing the trials at that level, at the range level, in numerous different herds. The industry is going to be a big part of that.
From a science, from a science perspective, I mean, it'd be great to have manipulations going on in multiple herds and just one or two and testing cause effect. But I think from a conservation perspective, I'm not sure it's going to happen. My understanding is it's going to be every tool we can throw at it everywhere we can and see what happens type of program.
Okay, I'm going to be a little devil's advocate here and just ask the question, do you think there's too much emphasis when we talk about mitigation procedures on linear features? And the reason I say that is, go back to Steve's model, where we're looking at an increase in ungulate biomass in the landscape. And my advisor, Dr. Stan Booten, would suggest that linear features in and of themselves don't create enough ungulate food on the landscape. So that's one issue. The other issue is if linear features were a big issue, or the dominating issue, let's say, then I think we would see more even predation on an annual basis instead of pulsed in the spring and summer. And what I didn't bring up in my talk is I said that linear feature density did equate to decreased calf survival, but it was much, much less important than the actual shift into those more productive landscapes, which, if you read into that, means that it's more of a numeric response in predators rather than the linear features. And then that comes back again to Nicole's work, who also suggested that it's more of a numeric response than the functional response provided by linear features. So I guess when you consider all that, should our focus with limited resources be on linear features?
Kim, you'd be a good one to tackle that one because you just looked at it.
Yeah, I think first comment with respect to linear features, and this comes from my PhD work, is that I didn't actually find deer presence associated with linear feature density. And I think, in a lot of my work, the climate response was actually stronger in certain cases. But where you do still have severe winter weather, having a higher level of disturbed land did equate to higher presence or potential presence of white-tailed deer. And so that's from the primary prey perspective. Just with respect to white-tailed deer, linear features don't seem to be a driving force. I think from a critical habitat perspective, just relating again to the recovery strategy, it's one place to recover habitat. And so I think that a lot of focus gets put there, and there have been these numerical responses seen with respect to predators on linear features. Exactly what the mechanism is seems to be a little bit more of a gray area. It's one thing industry can do on the ground while all of these other issues have to be going on. But I think one key point is that it has to be monitored. And you can monitor use. That's an easy-ish thing to do. Monitor when it's reclaimed. I mean, we still don't know when we call it reclaimed. We don't know when it's reclaimed from a predator, or prey, or caribou perspective. So there's a lot of unknowns, but it's one thing that can go on the landscape. I think probably in groups like this, it's a big focus, again, because reclamation is a management action that can be implemented by practitioners.
I'll just add to that as well that I think it's really important to remember that all linear features are not created equal, and they may or may not be a dominant effect on caribou in some areas, but I think what's really important to note is the nature, condition, and location of those linear features. I think that makes a big difference. If we get to the point where we can, for example, identify calving habitat as per your work, and we can model that, and then we can start prioritizing linear features to take them off the landscape and put our focus on linear features that for example, bisect or go directly to those kinds of calving habitats, those kinds of things, I think are key.
I was just going to add that, yeah, where I've landed is where Craig's coming from. I think that the effect of the early seral piece and the climate piece is perhaps an order of magnitude more important than the density of linear features in terms of producing ungulate pounds of flesh on the ground that are driving this predator-prey system. And I'm open to alternative information on that, and I'm willing to change my mind. But that's sort of where I sit right now. And of course, one of the things we have to be careful about with the federal recovery strategy is creating perverse incentives, because you can actually you can restore a heck of a lot more habitat if you're restoring linear features than you can if you are restoring areas of early seral, because of course the areas of early seral are buffered, and on a proportional increase you don't get nearly as much kind of credit for that reclamation than if you buffer a linear feature by 500 meters. So you might get to this situation where there's an incentive for companies to, mound a linear feature and say, there we go, we've reclaimed it, and we get credit for 500 meters on either side for a distance of 3 or 4 kilometers or something. You get into this strange situation. If you dig a pit toilet and you buffer it by 500 meters, you've created a 5 hectare disturbance. If you fill in your pit toilet, you've reclaimed 5 hectares of disturbance. And so you don't want to set up this perverse incentive for companies to meet these obligations and to kind of tick that box and meet the numbers that you're trying to get to without really getting at the key drivers that we think are operating on the ground.
I think a good piece of that too is that the 65% has that 500 hectare pit toilet.
Yeah.
And so we're playing with numbers that, like you said, haven't come from functional ecosystem, but it's what we have. So it's difficult to...
Well, we have it, but I think that there is quite a bit. I think that the federal government gave us quite a bit of latitude in this revised strategy, because we know that we're going to have to be doing these range plans that are going to have to rely on in many cases far more detailed data than just Landsat, and we're going to be bringing a lot more information, and Environment Canada has signaled a willingness to move off of some of these things if we have the rationale in place. And I think we have to roll up our sleeves and have those rationales that are more responsive to the conditions that we have locally. It was obviously important to have a broad-based national model that broadly informed things, but now we have to dig down to the next level.
Any more questions from Rob?
We'll let Marco go first.
Marco?
Oh, okay.
You got the mic.
Okay, I got the mic. I got the power.
Talking stick.
If I take us back just a little bit, I think we somewhat started on what we might do or monitor. A big frustration, and I'm going to blame it on the whole concept of buffering, is that it implies you understand something that goes on and that's somehow in reality proportional to your buffer. We got the same results basically when Boutner did the Sorensen thing. Got a different result in terms of what caused it, but the same thing about linear density still seemed to be associated. Forget buffers, just density associated. And so that got some of us thinking more along the lines of what makes a landscape productive and attractive for the primary prey and the predators, right? And the West Central modeling did the same thing, showing that the industrial linear feature provides nothing. It's insignificant from a forage standpoint. But we're sitting here with this energetics idea, this animal behavioral idea, but there's been a great reluctance to do any kind of research on that fine a scale. And because every time we try and mitigate, we're working mitigation plans right now, we're making animal behavioral assumptions about what we're going to accomplish with vegetation of a certain density or of a certain height or barriers of a certain distribution and placement, even as subtle, Amit, as you're suggesting about where it is on the landscape. I mean, there's been discussions in the past, do you focus on the lines that go from uplands to wetlands, or to take Craig's stuff, does that start to tell you areas you would focus? Again, if you make the assumption about what animal behaviors are making that productive for primary prey and wolves, leading to the numerical response that they are there in more frequently than they ever were before. Because caribou didn't historically live with them at high densities. They lived with them either hardly ever occurring or at extremely low densities. So from a research side, I've always been hoping that you kind of put your money where your mouth is. So say these are the 3 or 4 functional ecological mechanisms at the fine scale, and then as we go with all the things we're going to try and do on that landscape, that then at that fine scale we monitor. Because companies are challenged with how do you prove performance? Well, is it that you've got so many trees 1.5 meters tall? Yeah, at this point, that's all we can do, and we have to live with the assumption that that's fixing the issue with linear disturbances on the landscape. But I think we're a long ways from that, and I'm still going to go right back to the original buffering. It's around caribou use of the landscape, and I'm hearing nowhere here that it's really about caribou use of the landscape. It's about the other animals' use of the landscape.
Okay, I guess my comment back to that would be I agree, and I think there's fertile ground to start digging a little more into the caribou predator primary prey response to different kinds of linear features. It hasn't been done yet. We already have the information about the animals, lots of animal data out there, and we're starting to be able to suss out more detail about the linear features. So it's simply a matter of connecting a few bright grad students with some data, and we should get some answers to that. I think that's one of the areas of exploration. But it'll still get down to what should we do? And I would argue, we heard about grizzly bears and we heard about other values as well. A cumulative effects approach to this would be, if we understand that we've introduced a novel disturbance to the landscape and we can reclaim it, or we can see it already on a trajectory or something like that, we probably should do that anyway. The question is how much effort do we allocate to that in relation to some of the other things that we need to do? So I'm an advocate, I guess, of planning and understanding what's already out there, looking at what Mother Nature will do to help us in the way of, say, natural regeneration of some of these areas, and then making some decisions about whether additional investments are necessary just on recovering the linear footprint or not. And if they are, let's make them. It can't hurt to get rid of these things and get them back to a native ecosystems sooner rather than later, instead of just wondering whether we should do it. That's that perspective. But again, we need to look at all of these factors and do the kind of analysis that Steve does with his modeling, and look at what would be the most productive areas to focus resources on first. Not to say that the others aren't important, but they don't necessarily come first in the queue. We've only got about 2 more minutes left in the time slot, so anybody got some other burning questions back here? Yeah.
Just listening here from back here, it seems to me that we're kind of dancing around the issue and haven't got to the sort of the pragmatic what to do next thing. Like looking at the charts of the herd declines, people have mentioned that we're running out of time. I'm just wondering whether some sensitivity analyses could be done to look at key factors that are the most important, and whether it's predation or whatever, spend money and time to do the things that are necessary to stabilize the herd, and then look at some of these questions about habitat relationships and questions that may become moot if action isn't taken sooner, and the right actions.
I think you're right there. You have to staunch the flow of blood from the heart before you worry about the cut on your toe. It's absolutely clear that the short-term actions have to be taken, but that doesn't mean that these longer-term actions shouldn't be part of the mix. Anybody else got a thought on that?
I'll just say quickly that I think we know what has to be done at the North American Caribou Conference this past September. That was a common theme, was we know what needs to be done, we just need to go out and do it. And man, that may be oversimplifying this case, but we know that there's lots of levers that we have to pull. We know we have to pull them all at the same time, and I think that's part of the public message that needs to be out there, is that there's multiple levers that we need to pull, and we need to do them all at the same time.
We have to do it together.
And together, yeah.
Yeah. With
So-
consensus.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it's not consensus because, so my point is, do we want to make sure that caribou persists at the cost of an altered environment and heavy management? So basically, if we now decide to kill all the wolves, we'll stabilize caribou, and we will have an environment that at the current growth at its pace will be even more human altered, and in the future we'll have to control wolves forever. And also my comment is that, are you sure that caribou is endangered? I'm a geneticist, and I think that both wolves and caribou are species, and around the world there is more caribou than wolves. So the alternative is to use caribou as a sentinel to detect mechanisms that humans have altered, and at that point work on these human impacts and try to diminish the impacts. Again, there are two alternatives. Do we want to save caribou at the cost of heavy management, perhaps forever, or do we want to look at ways to diminish our impact on the environment? This is my question.
I think I'll give you the last comment there, Marco, because we've run out of time, and Carol's giving me the... So that'll conclude the panel discussion. If you'd like to take issue with Marco or respond to him, do that separately. Thanks very much.